to make well-informed licensing decisions. The presentations will focus on how to assess gender-based violence and how to apply the terrorism and transnational organized crime provisions of the Arms Trade Treaty. We have a range of organizations and experts here today, representatives of the Government of Ireland and Panama, the Stimson Center, Safer World, the Security Research Information Center based in Kenya, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and the Harvard Law School's International Human Rights Clinic. The side event will consist of 2 sessions. First, we turn our attention to Article 7.4, the gender-based violence provision, and afterwards we will hear more about the terrorism and transnational organized crime provisions of the Arms Trade Treaty in the second half of this event. Before we get started, I also want to express my sincere gratitude to Contour Arms, who is hosting the side event today. Allow me to make one housekeeping announcement. Due to the virtual setup, I kindly ask you to submit your questions in writing. And there is a specific function for that. You will see that right below on your screen on the right-hand side. It is called in English F and Q. In German, it is F and A, and probably in some other languages, other letters. But it is this function that would be perfect if you could use this function to pose your questions to the panelists. Please also indicate to which panelist you are addressing your question to. I am then happy to read out the questions on your behalf, and I will do that once all the presentations are done. So we have this combined Q&A session. Great, now having said this, let's start with session 1. As we all know, the Arms Trade Treaty requires states parties to consider the risk that an arms export could be used to commit or facilitate gender-based violence. This is a form of violence perpetrated against individuals because of their gender or sex, and it takes place all around the world. To undertake the risk assessment, licensing officers need to rely on very specific information, and this information can be found within a governmental structure, for example, the country desks or the Human Rights Division or the embassy abroad, but it can also be found in public sources provided by NGOs or other actors. The present paper that is researched and authored by the Stimson Center and the Harvard Law School's International Human Rights Clinic outlines key questions that licensing officers should ask of their information sources. The paper's goal is to assist licensing officers in obtaining the best information relevant to GBV and to enable them to make well-informed decisions and to be compliant with the Arms Trade Treaty. The Government of Ireland supported and funded this project, and I'd like to invite Emma Tobin from the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade to speak more about Ireland's work on gender-based violence. Emma Tobin, thank you very much for being here today with us. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Andre, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. Ireland was pleased to be able to fund and support the preparation of the report being presented today by Stimson on the ATT and GBV. Gender-based violence is a horizontal cross-cutting issue, and effectively addressing it is key to helping to achieve gender equality, sustainable development, and lasting peace and security. This need to address GBV has been reflected in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the UN Secretary-General's Agenda for Disarmament, and the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. The proliferation of small arms is strongly correlated with gender-based violence. In implementing effective export controls on arms, states can help stop the perpetuation of gender-based violence, and the ATT is crucial in achieving this. Colleagues will be aware that overlaps between GBV and the arms trade have featured prominently ever since the first negotiations on what eventually became the ATT. We've seen time and time again that there are very strong correlations between illicit arms flows in non-conflict settings and the rate of violence and intimidation against women. The inclusion of direct references to gender-based violence and arms in the preamble of the treaty and in Article 7.4 was a historic achievement, and it marked the first time GBV was explicitly referenced in an arms-related treaty. Its inclusion signified a formal recognition by state parties of the disproportionate gendered impacts of armed violence. Its inclusion also rectified the lack of an explicit reference to GBV in the UN Programme of Action on Small Arms and aligned the ATT with UN Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security. Gender-based violence can present in a myriad of different ways in risk assessments. It can be both overt through very visible patterns in honour killings or discreet through repression and threat. Unfortunately, underreporting of these crimes is systemic in all countries. So the feasibility of establishing GBV-specific assessments in export regimes is challenging due to the discrete nature of certain GBV violations and a lack of data, underscoring the need for qualitative, informed assessments of export license applications, end users, and destination countries. Being able to identify patterns or assess GBV risks in a given license is not only mandated by the treaty, but it's also vital in helping to combat GBV against women, girls, men, and boys. Additionally, the application of a gender perspective can also help shed light on other human rights infringements, which may not be immediately obvious. Colleagues may be aware that the women, peace and security agenda and gender equality are cross-cutting horizontal priorities in Irish foreign policy. Since 2017, following Ireland's submission of a working paper and recommendations calling on state parties to enhance its implementation of Article 7.4, Ireland, ATT state parties and civil society have been engaged in discussions on GBV risk assessments, information exchanges, and the development of appropriate guidance documents. The launch of today's report is a culmination of this proactive engagement. It draws on Stimson's and Harvard's expertise in this area and represents tangible, specific guidance on GBV risk assessments in the context of the ATT. Crucially, this guidance was developed through engagement directly with licensing officials and with their specific needs and resources in mind in order to be practical and practicable. The development of the questionnaire is universally applicable for all states parties and can help standardize the practice of looking specifically at GBV risks in the day-to-day processing of license applications. The effective implementation of Article 7.4 is a proof of concept, and it can demonstrate that tangible GBV provisions can and should be included in future international agreements. The report provides a baseline for how any further GBV risk assessments can be applied in a variety of different contexts. So having said that, I will now hand over to Verity Cole, Senior Advisor and Non-Resident Fellow at Stimson Centre, and Anna Crowe of the International Human Rights Clinic at Harvard Law School to talk us through this report and the assessment process. Thank you very much, and Anna and Verity, over to you.
Thank you, Emma, and thank you, Andre, for hosting our event today. It's great to be on the panel with so many colleagues and friends and governments who care about these issues and want to see practical work undertaken to increase effective implementation of the Arms Trade Treaty. So I'm going to start by thanking the Government of Ireland for funding and supporting this project and for not just being a gender champion on paper and in name, but through the actions and the statements and the work that you do in many different international fora. We first met to discuss this project in February 2020, and that was in the margins of the ATT meetings in Geneva. Little did we know that that would be our last in-person meeting now for well over a year. As researchers, though, we often conduct our interviews remotely. That is not uncommon. But what we normally have to draw on also are the conversations around the meetings after the meetings, where views can be exchanged in a more relaxed and human way. So I really do want to thank the states that took part in the interviews for this project or submitted your information in writing. It was essential for our understanding. You shared information about your licensing processes, and that allowed us to look at good practice and also to start to identify gaps that could be supported by this type of project. When the ATT entered into force, it contained within its articles something very unique in international law, Article 7.4. And that article, it's no surprise that when you have a new piece of legislation or regulation and it comes into being, that we're going to need new guidance and support to ensure that it is effectively understood and implemented. Much work, I'm really glad to say, has now been carried out on the issue of gender-based violence and the Arms Trade Treaty. There are resources by Control Arms, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, the ICRC, UNIDIR, and the International Gender Champions. And much of that work will be very familiar to many of you, but for others who would like to know more, I can highly recommend the resources produced by these organisations. Before joining Stimson, I was at the Control Arms Coalition, and we worked on a practical guide that focused on the general applicability of Article 7.4 in the ATT, looking at different indicators and ways that states could analyse that risk. And that guide formed part of a curriculum for training workshops in Riga in Latvia in 2019. And there are a couple of things that I want to reference here because they informed the thinking behind this project and paper. So the first thing is that we worked with a really excellent group of officials, some very experienced, others quite new in their role, from across Central and Eastern Europe. And the issues that we were talking about, gender-based violence, they can be uncomfortable and challenging for some. Individuals' understanding of them is shaped by the society they live in, their own lived experience, and the dominant political ideology that is the ultimate decision maker for their area of work. Throughout my time working in this field, I've heard many personal accounts of the direct effects of conventional weapons. And one that I'm going to highlight is from a woman who shared with me her experiences of growing up in a fragile state, where proliferation of small arms was high, government stockpiles had been pillaged, and it appeared that most men from their teenage years had access to weapons. The impact on the country, and in particular on the women and girls, was devastating. Education became impossible because of the threat of gender-based violence that girls would face while travelling to and from school. Young friends experienced sexual violence by armed perpetrators, and many simply disappeared. Before the widespread availability of arms, these types of gender-based violence were not prevalent in that country. While arms are not always responsible for the threat or prevalence of gender-based violence, there is a clear link between the risk of gender-based violence and the use or availability of weapons. This has been recognised by states in several processes, including the POA report to UNGA. The second thing I want to highlight from that workshop is that as we worked with the officials, and this was also borne out in the interviews we conducted for the new project also, it is the sources licensing officers go to for their inquiries, can often be government departments or overseas embassies, as Andre said. So the understanding of gender-based violence, not just by the licensing officers, but also by these information sources, is vitally important if we are to capture the range of gender-based violence that can be committed or facilitated by arms and the potential risk posed by a proposed transfer. So this project is a response to all of that. And if we accept that GBV is often underreported and less visible than other violations, then it naturally follows that without that detailed and separate analysis of GBV risks, elements of concerns that may not be captured in a more general human rights analysis can remain consistently overlooked or minimised. I'm going to hand over to my brilliant colleague Anna now, who's going to walk you through the paper we developed together. Thank you.
Thank you, Verity. And I would also like to, of course, extend my thanks to the Government of Ireland and to all of the other parties that supported this work. So as Verity said, I'm going to briefly run through the content of the paper that we produced. I think everyone here is familiar with Article 7.4, which requires states to assess the risk of a proposed export being used to commit or facilitate GBV. And as Verity said, our aim with this publication is really to provide practical guidance for licensing officers to help them seek information to complete that GBV risk assessment. So the report itself is in 3 parts. The first part is the questionnaire itself, which is relatively short. It just comprises 10 questions in the 3 areas on the screen, which I'll come to shortly. Part 2 is an explanatory guide to the questionnaire that gives contextualized examples in relation to each question, as well as outlines terms and concepts that are used in the questionnaire. And Part 3 contains questions that are organised in parallel to the questions for information sources, questions for licensing officers themselves. So the questionnaire itself can be found on pages 9 to 10 of the report. No need to try and read it here. I'm about to go through it. I just wanted to give a sense of the length of the questionnaire to show that it's not overwhelming. It's really manageable. And as Verity and Emma mentioned, the questions are really assuming an information source largely within a licensing officer's own government, someone like an embassy official, but some of the questions could also appropriately be posed to officials in other governments or within intergovernmental organisations. And as Verity mentioned, this is meant to complement so many of the other resources that have been developed in this space, particularly the Control Arms Practical Guide. So going to the questionnaire itself, the first part of the questionnaire, part A, contains 3 questions. And the goal of this set of questions is to help a licensing officer to understand the exporter and the end user's human rights records, which then helps them make a preliminary determination about the level of scrutiny that an application might warrant. So as you know, end users are frequently military actors, police, or other entities with links to these groups. And when the end user is a state actor, it carries with it the human rights obligations of that state. But exporters, as businesses, also have a responsibility to respect human rights. So the answers in this to this section relate to those obligations. And because the section takes this much broader ambit, it's not just covering GBV, it of course should inform and be informed by the more general human rights assessment that the licensing officer or the information source is undertaking to comply with Article 7 more broadly. The second set of questions is about GBV in the recipient state, and the goal of this section is to assist licensing officers to understand the conditions in the recipient state that are relevant to gender-based violence, to allow them to build up an overall picture of the situation before they assess the possible consequences of the specific proposed export that they're looking at. So the first question asks the information source to assess the extent and severity of gender-based violence in the recipient state. So GBV, as we know, is violence directed against a person on the basis of their gender or sex. And as the questionnaire outlines, it can be physical, sexual, psychological, or socioeconomic. And it's really important that information sources don't just reach for the most obvious examples of GBV, but actually consider the overall situation across these 4 types of gender-based violence. Question 2 in the second section asks the information source to consider factors in the recipient state that could contribute to underreporting or issues with GBV statistics, which is a well-known challenge in this area. So for example, an information source may read a report that characterizes data on convictions for rape as representing the prevalence of rape in the country, but the actual prevalence is going to be higher because not all rapes are reported to the police or brought to trial or charged or result in convictions. So that's the kind of information that an information source could flag. Excuse me. And the answer to this question assists the licensing officer to really make a more realistic prediction about potential future GBV. Question 3 in this section speaks to the role that the state plays in setting general legal and cultural frameworks around GBV. So an information source responding to question 3 should examine both gender-based violence committed by state agents, but also whether the state itself has failed to meet its obligation to prevent, investigate, and punish gender-based violence by private actors. So if there's a robust legal framework in place, that's a relevant piece of information. But if the framework isn't well implemented and in practice just exists in paper, it's going to have a limited effect on the GBV risks that people within the state face. So that's again something the information source would highlight in answer to that question. So the final section of questions, part C, really gets to the nub of the risk assessment. And of course, much of the information provided in answer to the previous questions is also going to be relevant to this part of the assessment. I guess before getting into the questions themselves, I wanted to say a few words first about how arms can be used to commit or facilitate GBV. So the most direct link between conventional arms and gender-based violence exists when arms themselves are used to directly inflict harm. So for example, using arms to kill or injure people. And when those people are targeted on the basis of their gender or sex, that violence constitutes gender-based violence. However, arms can also be used to commit gender-based violence without being discharged, such as the use of weapons to threaten, to coerce, or to intimidate people. And importantly for the test in the ATT, arms can also be used to facilitate rather than commit directly gender-based violence, which just means that rather than being directly involved in the commission of gender-based violence, they just make the act easier. And facilitation can encompass a wide range of acts, in some cases several steps removed from the harm itself. So the first question in this section asks whether the type of conventional arms in the proposed export has been used to commit or facilitate gender-based violence in the recipient state. And that importantly includes the 4 types of GBV that I just outlined: physical, sexual, psychological, and socioeconomic. For example, if the exporter has applied to export battle tanks, then the information source is looking at whether battle tanks have been implicated in gender-based violence in the recipient state. So just to give an example of that, let's say you have an export application that covers armoured combat vehicles, and the information source knows from intelligence reports that armoured combat vehicles have been used and are often used to transport female prisoners to a detention facility where rape and other forms of sexual violence are known to be prevalent. So that's the type of information that this first question is seeking, or first question is seeking to elicit. The second question here asks if there is information that links the end user to the commission or the facilitation of any of those 4 types of gender-based violence. And if there is information linking the end user to gender-based violence, then there's a follow-up question of whether the type of arms in the proposed export was involved. The third question is about the relationships that the end user has with known perpetrators of gender-based violence in the recipient state. And as a follow-up question, there's a question of whether there are risks that the export could end up in the hands of these perpetrators. And then the final question is a catch-all, whether there are factors that in the view of the information source increase or decrease the likelihood that the export could be used to commit or facilitate gender-based violence in the recipient state. So any other factors that the information source thinks might be relevant. And examples of that could include recent military leadership changes that have resulted in a shift in military culture, for example, planned trainings or shifts in the political landscape. So there's obviously a lot more detail in the report itself, but hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense of what it contains. And I'll hand back to Verity now.
Thank you, Anna, for taking us through that. And when we get to the Q&A session of the whole event, I'll drop a link to the guide into the chat, but not to detract from the other speakers by doing it now. Very briefly, we want you to take this document, to use it in your daily work, to share it with your colleagues in different roles within your governments that are responsible for providing information as part of the risk assessment process. Civil society, we would urge you to look at these questions and think about how do you evidence forms of GBV and make that information available to those who are providing information for the risk assessment process. There's a lot more I could say, but I will stop there and hand over to my colleague Stephen Singo Machofi from the Security Research Information Centre in Kenya. Stephen, over to you.
Thank you, Verity. I think my internet is not very stable, and for that reason, I think I will put off my video, if you don't mind. I could share my screen if it's possible. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yep, it's all good.
And you can hear me?
Yep, all good, all good.
Thank you. All right. Mine is just a very short presentation to sort of like give a picture of this situation of GBV in Kenya, because my organization carried a study a couple of years ago that was focusing on the phenomenon of GBV, gender-based violence in the country. We focused on 3 counties, and we thought that the findings from the 3 counties could be used to make a generalization of the situation in our country. Those who are familiar with Kenya, those counties are Bungoma and Uasin Gishu and Nakuru. And the idea was basically to spotlight on those counties that had been deemed to have higher levels of GBV, to find out the perceptions of GBV in those areas by the people, the drivers and causes of GBV, the mechanisms for intervention, and the stakeholders involved. So that's what I'm going to share with you very briefly. And then I will speak again just briefly on the phenomenon of organized crime and terrorism, because as you know, Kenya is one of those countries that has suffered from the effects of terrorism, especially by the Al-Shabaab terrorist group. So in terms of perception of GBV, what we found was basically that the majority of people understand GBV to mean it is violence that is directed at either gender, whether men or the female or male gender. A smaller percentage thought that GBV relates to what is to violence against women, essentially. In those counties, what you can see on my screen, the cases in terms of prevalence, one of the counties, the county of Bungoma, showed prevalence of about 40%. Nakuru showed closely followed by Nakuru, which showed 38.7%, and the least of them was Uasin Gishu, which had a prevalence rate of about 20%. The forms of gender-based violence were identified as FGM, rape and defilement, forced marriage, and discrimination of women on the basis of not being able to bear a son. So as a woman, if you don't have sons, then you are likely to be discriminated against. In terms of the perception, the common types of GBV, the graph there, I don't know whether you can be able to see it, but you will see that the highest forms, the highest types in terms of perception were seen to be sexual and gender-based violence. I mean, sexual violence in terms of rape, sexual assault and harassment, and then violence in close relationships, as well as forced marriages. Moving on to the question as to whether respondents had witnessed or been victims of GBV in the past 1 year. The statistics shown yes at 70, almost 71%, and no at 29%. So you'll see the rate there was quite high. And then in terms of the main causes, we identified issues like drug and alcohol abuse, traditional practices, and insecurity. But I also need to mention that we were informed that in some places, like in Bungoma County, there was evidence of use of small arms and light weapons in the commitment, in the actualization of specific forms of GBV. That is significant in the context of our discussion today. And then in terms of the drivers, we saw issues such as the prevalence of illicit brew in some of the areas, issues around property ownership, where women are not allowed to own property and cannot inherit property even when their husbands have died. Then the breakdown of family values and single parenthood. I won't spend time on the perpetrators. In terms of mitigation, we found that there is civil society engagement. Some civil society are supporting women groups, especially in Bungoma County, which is worst affected. Then we saw interventions by government through the community policing committees and local Nyumba Kumi initiatives, and also local outreach programs. Then in terms of recommendations, as I wind up, the study found that there is need to firmly deal with the perpetrators of gender-based violence in terms of applying the law, then reduce structural causes of GBV through addressing the drivers, then broadening sensitization and training to deal with cultural and patriarchal factors that exacerbate GBV, and also be able to apply gender-sensitive concerns in county and central government development planning. Coming to organized crime and terrorism, as I mentioned earlier, we happen to be in a zone that is highly affected by organized crime and terrorism. And in terms of organized crime, we have armed extortion gangs, and most of them are armed. Some of them are militia, and these have been used to perpetuate crime in urban areas. And we have human trafficking, again, which also in some cases, arms are used, and human smuggling, wildlife poaching, which is big business and is involving players that are external to the country. The Chinese are said to be very interested in some of the wildlife that is poached from our parks. And then the smuggling of goods, especially sugar and charcoal from across the border in Somalia. And then in terms of terrorism, then you have Al-Shabaab and its affiliates. And the issue of terrorism is linked to radicalization and violent extremism in one of our regions, which is the coastal region. And there is then that risk of arms that are being, proliferated from across the border in Somalia, finding their way into urban centers in our country and worsening security concerns. Then that has impacted negatively on tourism and investment, and has also in a way also fueled and has been fueled by the exacerbated proliferation of small arms and light weapons in the region. For want of time, I think I want to stop there, Chair. I hope I am within your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma, Verity, and Stephen for these very insightful presentations. As I said, you're all welcome to post questions anytime using the questions function. I will take them at the end, but you may already post them right now, just as a reminder. And I suggest we continue right now with the session 2 on the topic of terrorism and transnational organized crime. And we base this discussion on the latest briefing paper of Safer World on this subject. The Safer World's ATT expert group maintains an informal process among diplomats, national policy practitioners, and civil society experts from around the world. The aim of the group is to share experiences and to provide a clear understanding of how to maximize the effectiveness of the treaty. This also includes issues that the formal ATT process either has not yet addressed or has struggled to make progress on. The expert group has held a number of meetings in all world regions. Once upon a time, this was face-to-face. Now, more recently, it was also online. And it has produced 7 briefings on a variety of ATT-related subjects. The latest briefing, briefing number 7, has the title Arms Exports, Terror and Crime, Reducing Risk under the ATT. And it is up for discussion today. Now, before Gillian Rafferty from WILPF and Roy Isbister from Safer World introducing your paper, I want to hand over the floor to Ms. Grisel Rodriguez from the Permanent Mission of Panama to the UN in Geneva. Grisel, thank you very much for being here with us. You have the floor.
Thank you, Andre. It is an honor and a privilege to be part of this esteemed panel. Transnational organized crime and terrorism are complex phenomena that threaten peace and security, the rule of law, sustainable development, and the protection of human rights. As such, they are of alarming concern to the international community. These criminal networks not only exploit the vulnerability of countries experiencing conflict and instability, they affect all states from all regions, whether as countries of supply, transit, or demand. Let's not forget that every day these criminal cells are drug trafficking, smuggling desperate migrants, and trafficking and exploiting vulnerable women, men, and children. We are also witnessing wildlife crimes and the destruction of cultural heritage by criminals and terrorists. Many of the benefits of globalization, such as easier and faster connections, financial flows, and international travels, have created a wide range of opportunities for transnational organized crime groups and terrorist organizations to flourish, diversify, and expand their activities. New information and communications technologies have also increased their criminal capability. One of the pressing challenges is the growing nexus between transnational organized crime and terrorism. Terrorists are more involved in criminal activities and modus operandi inherent to transnational organized crime groups, either for survival or financing their operations. Similarly, transnational organized crime groups find it profitable to resort to methods applied by terrorists to achieve their ends. So, what does this have to do with arms trade? They are intrinsically linked and create a vicious circle. Funds to buy arms come from criminal activities, and the illicit and unregulated trade of conventional arms and their diversion also provides income and resources for transnational organized crime and terrorist groups. These arms serve as a means to facilitate violent crimes, as a tool to exercise and maintain power, and as lucrative trafficking commodities, which in turn fuel armed conflicts and violence, including gender-based violence, corrupt society, and endanger good governance. Most of these criminals become involved in arms trafficking through other criminal activities, which allow them to draw on existing contacts, knowledge of routes, and infrastructure. This also explains the logistical support and the operational capacity of these organizations that carry out terrorist attacks around the world. My own country, Panama, has been the target of organized crime, including drug trafficking and illicit trade in arms, due to its privileged geographical position for maritime and land-based trade. These problems should not be seen in isolation, as the violence caused by drug trafficking is exacerbated by the illicit trade and diversion of small arms and light weapons that are used by criminals to guard and transport drug shipments. Every year, these activities claim more lives in Latin America and the Caribbean than the armed conflicts in the rest of the world. In our view, those security challenges need to be addressed more in depth in the ATT discussions, as we strongly believe that the provisions within its Articles 7(1)(b)(3) and 4 can make a difference in countering terrorism and transnational organized crime by supporting the wealth of international, regional, and sub-regional instruments already in place. But the success will depend greatly on the capacity and effectiveness of states to implement all the legal frameworks at their disposal, including the ATT, particularly with respect to the imperative of reducing human suffering and preventing or stopping illicit transfers. The protection of our populations and the shared responsibility of the international community should be the terms of reference to limit the capacity of these criminal networks. I encourage all participants to consider this topic in future ATT deliberations, either as a thematic discussion or within the working group on effective treaty implementation. The debate could focus on enhancing the ATT's interaction with existing instruments to combat terrorism and transnational organized crime, and to reach a common understanding in order to mitigate the risk of conventional arms diversion in this specific context. Now, I would like to give the floor to Ms. Gillian Rafferty of Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and Mr. Roy Isbister of Safer World to introduce their paper, which I believe provides good guidance for a better understanding of the states parties' obligations under ATT related to transnational organized crime and terrorism, and will help to achieve coherence in implementation practices. Over to you, Gillian.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation and for outlining the importance of these topics and their relationship to the arms trade, and for the very kind words about our paper. I'm going to share my screen now so you can see my slides. Are you able to see the slides?
Yep.
Perfect. Great. So as the previous presenters have mentioned, the paper that we worked on and that we're presenting today is about the terrorism and transnational organized crime provisions of the ATT, which are part of Article 7's risk assessment, as I'm sure you all know. Our aim in writing this paper was to look at these provisions because they've been spoken about very little since the treaty entered into force, but they're important parts of the treaty. They're on equal footing in the risk assessment with the human rights and IHL components of the risk assessment, despite not having been sort of robustly discussed in treaty settings. So to give you a sense of what I'll do in this presentation, first I'll just have a quick look at the actual text of the treaty on those two provisions. Then I'll do a review of the conventions and protocols that are covered by these provisions relating to terrorism and transnational crime. Then I'll talk a bit about what commit or facilitate means in the context of these provisions, since it's used in those provisions as well. And then I'll quickly discuss how you relate peace and security to these parts of the treaty. So I know that everybody here is already familiar with the text of Article 7, which is the export risk assessment, but just to review the elements of Article 7 that are relevant to today's discussion, Article 7 requires that when a state party is considering a potential export of arms, they must assess the potential that the export would first contribute to or undermine peace and security. And second, that the export could be used to, among several other things, which I've omitted for the sake of the shortness of the slide, commit or facilitate an act that constitutes an offense under the international conventions or protocols relating to terrorism and to transnational organized crime. And I'll note this here, and I may remind you of this later, but the treaty does make explicitly clear that the relevant treaties are those that the exporting state is bound by. There's no need to analyze the importing state's obligations when conducting this assessment. So now I want to talk a bit about what this means in practice, and we'll start with the provision on terrorism, which is 7.1b3. The treaty language asks states to consider the potential that the export could be used to commit or facilitate an act that constitutes an offense under international conventions or protocols relating to terrorism. So first, I want to be clear about what conventions or protocols are covered when we say international conventions and protocols relating to terrorism. Currently, at the global level, there are 19 treaties and protocols that fall under this umbrella. There are also regional and sub-regional agreements that are relevant, but because we were aiming for a broad audience with this paper, we focused on the global instruments as they are more universal. I want to let you know I'm not going to tell you what those 19 treaties are right now, but the annex of the paper has a complete list of those treaties. So I would refer you guys to that. And again, we'll share the link to the paper once the presentations are finished. The next thing you need to know is what constitutes an offense under those treaties, since that's what the ATT asks states to consider. The good news is the treaties make the answer very clear. An offense is any act that those treaties define as constituting terrorism, or any act that the treaties otherwise label as wrongful or punishable. The way these treaties work is they tend to say something to the effect of states must criminalize these actions, or these actions constitute terrorism. So all of that language points you to an offense as defined under those treaties. Again, I will just give you guys a heads up about that annex. In addition to listing the treaties that are relevant, those 19 treaties, we've also comprehensively explained every single offense defined under those treaties. So you need look no further to know what offenses count than to the annex of this report. The transnational organized crime provision works very similarly. Again, you have to be clear about which conventions and protocols are covered. Unlike terrorism, where there are 19, there's only 4 for transnational organized crime. So a much smaller number, much more manageable and easier to wrap your head around. And those are at the global level. And again, I'll remind everybody that there's, of course, regional and sub-regional instruments, but we focused on the global ones. And just like with terrorism, offenses under those treaties are easily defined as either things those treaties call transnational organized crime, or other actions that those treaties label as wrongful or punishable. And they use the same kind of language as the terrorism treaties. Just like with terrorism, in the annex, we provided a list of those 4 treaties and protocols, as well as a comprehensive explanation of every single offense defined under those 4 treaties and protocols. Okay, so we know which treaties we look at, we know what offenses we care about, but now we have to understand, if we're conducting this risk assessment, what commit or facilitate means, and how that relates to these 2 provisions. So when we're looking at treaty terms, as I'm sure you all know, we look to what they mean in a sort of ordinary sense, and we have to understand that different words in the same list mean distinct things. So if arms or items could be used to commit or facilitate an offense, we look at those 2 words and say, what can they mean, and how does what they mean distinguish those 2 terms from one another? The easiest way to understand commit or facilitate is that commit implies directness, it implies perpetration or directly carrying something out, and facilitate implies making something possible or easier. It implies a less direct relationship and encompasses certainly a broader range of usage of conventional arms or items. As Anna mentioned in her presentation, facilitate can encompass uses that are one or more, even several steps removed from the actual harm that you care about. So in the context of the ATT, we then have two fundamental questions that we care about asking. The first is, how can a weapon be used to actually commit an offense? And a weapon is used to commit an offense when the weapon is directly used to cause the offense itself, to cause a harm that itself is an offense under international law. And I'm going to give you guys some examples to make this a little clearer. The second question is, how can a weapon be used to facilitate an offense? And that, as I was just mentioning, is when the weapon is one or more steps removed from the harm that constitutes an offense. It doesn't mean the weapon isn't causing harm itself, but the harm it causes is one or more steps removed from the actual offense that's defined under international law. So I'm going to give you a quick example of each from terrorism law. I will say I'm giving you quick examples in the interest of time. If additional examples would be helpful during the Q&A, let me know. I have plenty in my back pocket ready to go. So let's look at two examples from terrorism law. So under international law relating to terrorism, it is an offense to hijack a civil aircraft. If you use a weapon to actually wrest control of the aircraft from the authorized pilots, you have used that weapon to commit the offense of hijacking the aircraft. The weapon is directly used in the actual offense of taking control of the aircraft. So that's a commission example. But what if we think about facilitation? Another offense defined under terrorism law is using a ship to further a terrorist purpose. So presumably, to use a ship to further a terrorist purpose, you also have to be in control of the ship. It might not be a ship that you have the rightful authorized use of. So if you use a weapon to wrest control of a ship, and then you use that ship to further a terrorist purpose, you're not furthering the terrorist purpose using the weapon, but the weapon was still integral to the offense because it facilitated it. In order to use the ship for a terrorist purpose, you had to first, in a predicate sense, wrest control of the ship, and the weapon was used in that way. So in that case, the weapon committed, and if wresting control of the ship were an offense, that it would be used to commit the offense of wresting control of the ship, but it facilitates the offense of using the ship to further a terrorist purpose. Like I said, happy to go through more examples later on if that's helpful, but those are two that I think make a clear distinction between the terms. So now we have to get to peace and security. As you guys know, Article 7.1a says that states have to assess the potential that the weapons would contribute to or undermine peace and security. I do want to say quickly that, of course, this is, in a sense, a separate step in the assessment. It's 7.1a that's separate from 7.1b. So you have to consider that on its own before you even get to 7.1b. And the terms contribute to or undermine peace and security are really central. We have to consider peace and security itself. It's not qualified in the treaty to be regional or national or international. So we understand it to encompass all three of those things: national, regional, and international peace and security. It's, I think, very important to emphasize that in order to assess the impact of a transfer on peace and security, states have to conduct a truly holistic assessment that includes a real assessment of human welfare, and it includes a real focus on protecting the material conditions of peace, not just the presence or absence of conflict. There are a wide range of factors that states parties should consider when actually conducting this part of the assessment in good faith. In the interest of time, I will direct you guys to the report for an explanation of those factors. But again, if anybody wants to talk about them later in this session, feel free to ask. So even though, as I said before, the peace and security assessment is its own step in Part A of 7.1, it's inevitable that looking into how weapons might be used to commit or facilitate this Part B violations, serious violations of human rights law and humanitarian law, or offenses under terrorism and transnational crime law, looking at how weapons might be used to commit that type of offense could also uncover some additional concerning information regarding the effects of the transfer on peace and security. So here's how we suggest that you think through the interrelationship between those two fields of law and peace and security. So first, we suggest an initial presumption. Terrorism and organized crime, when left unchecked, clearly undermine peace and security. So any weapons transfer that might be used to commit or facilitate offenses under those treaties necessarily also undermines peace and security. It's, I think, pretty hard to make an argument that weapons being used for crime and terrorism are not undermining peace and security. But we also have a sort of second tier additional inquiry. It's obvious, as I said, that weapons that are used for terrorism or crime undermine peace and security. But weapons used against terrorism or organized crime can do the same, which is just to say that even if a state is fully in compliance with obligations under transnational crime and terrorism law, and even if you were to find that the weapons weren't going to be used to commit offenses under terrorism and transnational crime law, that doesn't imply necessarily that the weapons are supporting peace and security. And in fact, it could still imply that they're undermining it. So we just sort of advocate strongly in the paper for a careful and holistic assessment, even if you don't find, of course, that the weapons are going to be used to commit offenses under terrorism and crime law. The bottom line is that compliance with those treaties does not in and of itself guarantee a contribution to peace and security. The last thing I'll say before I turn it over to Roy is that we've just outlined a very simple two-step process when attacking the sort of 7.1b 3 and 4 assessment. First, an exporting state has to continue to update themselves in identifying the legal instruments in these two fields of law that they are a party to, since it's the exporting state's obligations that matter, and they must keep sort of an accurate and running list of the offenses that are included under those instruments. And then they have to really, in good faith, assess the risk that the proposed transfer might be used to commit or facilitate any of those offenses. Of course, that relies on a lot of things like identifying appropriate and reliable sources of information, which was brought up in the GBV part of the conversation, attending to that distinction between commit and facilitate, looking at past behavior, current circumstances, and future trends, and also looking at the effect on peace and security. I'll close my part of the presentation for now. I'll be happy to answer questions later if that's useful, and I will pass the floor back to my colleague, Roy.
Thank you, Gillian. I am not going to say an awful lot on top of that. What I should do, first of all, is to thank Andre. Well, thank everybody who's on this, who's part of the panel, but thanking Andre as a representative of the Swiss government, because it's the Swiss government and the German government that have been funding our work with recently with the expert group and who have funded this the production of this paper, which will shortly be linked to in the chat. And I'm not going to say much because Gillian's largely done it all. All I really want to do is just stress a couple of points that strike me as key. Now, but I also think it's worth possibly noting that the kind of, if you're looking at the arms trade and transnational organized crime, terrorism, this kind of, in a way, this feels like this should be the relatively straightforward bit, because states generally, you would like to think, are not going to want to supply arms that will be used to commit crimes. They're not going to want to supply arms that are going to be used for terrorist purposes. And so, in a sense, this should be some of the less controversial parts of Article 7, I guess, if you like. But there are a couple of extra complications in there that I would like to kind of stress or underline, and one relates to corruption. Now, corruption is a big deal in the arms trade. It's it is often being reported as probably one of the first or second most prone to corruption type of industry. So it is a serious issue to consider. Corruption doesn't receive much of a direct mention in the treaty. It gets mentioned on a couple of occasions in Article 11.5, when states parties are encouraged to share relevant information with one another on effective measures to address diversion, and such information may include information on illicit activities, including corruption, and then international trafficking routes, blah, blah, blah. And in Article 15.6, states parties are encouraged to take national measures, which is Article 15 on international cooperation. States parties are encouraged to take national measures and to cooperate with each other to prevent the transfer of conventional arms becoming subject to corrupt practices. So, okay, that's all well and good, but what does it actually mean, and how should that be implemented in practice? very unclear. But if we go back to the transnational organised crime part of Article 7, and one of the four conventions that is mentioned in the paper is the UN Convention Against Transnational Organised Crime. And under that convention, it is an offence to attempt to bribe an official. It's an offence for an official to accept or to attempt to solicit a bribe. And it's an offence to be an accomplice to the commission of corruption. In which case, this particular article, 7(1)(b)(4), opens up a much stronger obligation on states parties to address corruption risks. It needs to be part of the risk assessment, and if the conclusion is that there is a real risk, then the next step is to refuse the transfer. So I think that's certainly adds something to a lot of interpretations of the treaty. Looking at the peace and security side of this, so picking up on what Gillian was saying towards the end of her presentation, her kind of bottom line point that compliance with terror and transnational organised crimes treaties does not guarantee a contribution to peace and security, I would obviously agree with. But things can go beyond that, because there are cases where dubious behaviour has been justified as necessary for counter-terror purposes. And certainly since 9/11, that's now close on 20 years, been any number of occasions where counter-terror becomes a rallying cry for to justify some very questionable actions. It leads to the demand for equipment in order to combat terror or transnational organised crime, and thereby to support peace and security. But even if the arms are used exactly for their stated purpose, it doesn't follow that they necessarily are making a contribution. And in fact, there are plenty of cases where arms that are bought and used to combat crime or conduct identified as terrorist being used to commit or facilitate violations, and thereby are actually undermining peace and security. So the critical point here is that we need to avoid the Arms Trade Treaty being used to justify this kind of logic that, okay, so my country is suffering from terror or transnational organised crime. I need arms to combat terror and transnational organised crime. The Arms Trade Treaty is about preventing and combating terror and transnational organised crime. Therefore, under the ATT, I am entitled to receive arms for these purposes. So I think a proper reading of the treaty does not lead you down that path at all. And indeed, regardless of whether arms are used for the purpose of combating transnational organised crime or terrorism, where they would be in breach of Article 6, or where they're at risk of causing the consequences that are identified in Article 7(1) and Article 7(4) relating to GBV, and Article 11 on diversion, then the treaty directs states parties to not permit the transfer. That's really all I have to say, so I'll leave it there. Thank you for your attention. Back to Andre, I think.
Thank you very much to all of you, Grisel, Roy, Gillian. Thank you for these very insightful presentations. We have now heard a lot of information, and I am sure this raised a few questions. So I'm happy to go now into the Q&A session. And as being the chair, I would like to take the opportunity to also ask the first question. And this goes out to Verity. And I'm asking this question also in my function as a licensing officer. What would be now the immediate and practical actions that governments could take away following the event? And how could we enhance our licensing process in relation to the risks on gender-based violence as you presented in your presentation?
Thank you for the question, and Gillian, I'm really excited to be reading yours and SaferWorld's new paper. I'm glad that part of the treaty is getting some attention now also, so congratulations on that that contribution to what we're all here to do. In terms of your question, Andre, I think there's a few different things that could be considered. So where your information sources sit, what are the kind of list of NGOs that they take information and data from? Are they just working with organisations that look at violence against women, or are they taking a more holistic approach to what we mean by gender-based violence? Do they have good contacts with LGBTI communities in the country? Are they really thinking about the whole range of violations that this article asks you to consider? I'm also quite interested in the idea of open license relationships that countries have, and whether they were in place before the Arms Trade Treaty came into force, and whether with this new provision, all of those existing relationships need to be looked at again through the GBV lens to make sure that a country that on many respects may seem like a good trading partner, but it could have very problematic gender-based violence problems within the country that maybe weren't picked up when those initial licenses were put in place. We have been invited by COARM to come and talk about the paper and discuss it with licensing officers there. That's the ideal audience that we would really like to be talking to. So others that might be in the audience that aren't part of that group, if they would like to approach Simpson and Harvard and have this discussion with us and think through how to apply the tools and techniques in the paper, we'd be really open to talking to you and doing that work. I think I'll leave it there for now and let you move on to the next question.
Thank you very much, Verity. Duly noted. The next question I would ask goes out to Roy. And in your paper, it says that being out of compliance with the terror and international organized crime obligation, this implicitly would undermine peace and security. Now, also in your paper, it states that being in compliance with this obligation, that this may also undermine peace and security. Could you elaborate a little bit on that, what seems to be contradictory in a way?
Yeah, so, and I think possibly Gillian can come in as well and help me out here if she feels I'm not doing a good enough job here. I mean, it's kind of like what I was saying. It's fairly obvious that if you are going to be supplying arms, which with the expectation that there, or with an understanding that there is a risk that they will be used to commit crimes or terrorist acts, you're probably not helping with peace and security. I think we can all see that that's not too complicated. Where it gets more interesting, of course, is that the idea that if your stated purpose for purchasing arms is to combat terror or crime, means that you will automatically be contributing to peace and security, then I think that may be the case. I'm not saying it can't be the case, but it's certainly not necessarily the case, and that can break down at a couple of different levels. So one is that, as I was kind of saying, there has developed this tendency to claim that whatever you are doing is to counter terrorism, and so you will justify your actions on that basis. So an example of how that may play out in reality is you may have a group that has ambitions towards self-determination that may or may not include elements that are using violence, but the claim of the actor that wants to purchase the arms is that those are needed to stop that group from engaging in terrorist activity, where others may say, hold on a second, that's definitely not terrorist activity, and you are not contributing to peace and security by steamrolling in there in that kind of way. So that would be one example. The other is where there may be a general acceptance that the purpose is to counter terror. However, the conduct that is used with that equipment is such that it actually undermines the intended outcome. And I think some areas of in the Sahel are examples. There are examples there where the actions of security forces can be seen as, look, they do have a terrorist threat to combat, but the conduct of those of the forces that are in action is actually turning the population against them and potentially driving populations into the arms of those actors that are considered to be terrorists. So those would be examples, I think, of where how that can play out. I don't know, Gillian, if I'm missing something or if I've done a reasonable job there.
No, so I completely agree with what Roy said. I'll just add one quick thing, which is that I think there's a way to think about sort of two broad categories of the ways that counterterrorism or countercrime efforts might in fact undermine peace and security. One, and this may not be the most pleasant take, I suppose, but one is that sometimes those labels are used for operations that realistically have different purposes, where an intent may be more repressive, but it may be labeled as a counterterrorism effort, but repressive purposes are not really consistent with peace and security. But the other is simply that there's at times there's some tension between countercrime and counterterrorism efforts and the realization of rights, and even the proper realization of IHL, not even just of human rights law. And as we discussed earlier when I was talking about the paper and peace and security is not just about the absence of conflict, but it's about the material conditions of peace, the full respect for human rights, and human welfare. So even though there may be elements of countercrime or counterterror policies or actions that do, at least in intent, mean to bolster peace and security by reducing harmful phenomena, that doesn't mean that the tactics they use don't also perhaps undermine some elements of human welfare or come into tension with human rights law, and those things undermine peace and security. So it's just that there's sometimes some tension there, and we don't want there to be an assumption that countering terror, countering crime necessarily bolsters peace and security. It really requires a more careful assessment.
Thank you very much to the both of you. So this also goes a little bit into the direction of the challenges that licensing officers face in weighing a bit the short-term against medium and long-term effects, and how to evaluate and look at the probability of these effects in the short, medium, and long term. So I completely understand the challenges, and thank you for the answers. One more question from my side to Stephen. In your presentation, you very nicely showed the drivers of GBV and also measures to prevent GBV. And I was wondering, you talked about the different mitigation measures that you are enacting. And have there already been studies on these measures? Have they shown a result in reduced GBV, or is this still too early to tell?
Thank you, Chair. I think it is too early to tell. We would have to expect that another study, has to be done to be able to say this intervention has had this or that impact. So for now, I wouldn't be able to tell you that, for example, through the community policing interventions and Nyumba Kumi, which have been seen to really work, because this improve the relationships between the police and the communities, and especially in terms of building confidence. Because as you remember, in our part of the world, there has not been very good relations between the people and the police. So people are not usually very likely to go and report incidents of violations to the police. And this intervention on community policing and the Nyumba Kumi, we call it, is about improving that relationship so that the police and people can continue to work together closely. People can have the confidence to report to the police and the police to take action. Now, it's now about, say, I think, what is it? Just a couple of years since they began to embrace the Nyumba Kumi initiative, maybe more. And as I said, we would have to do another study to see whether we can say these interventions are working or not. Yeah.
Thank you very much for these answers. I would now like to open the floor to everybody's questions questions. I can see we already have received some. Please feel free to pose further questions. They're a little bit small on my screen, so I'm trying to read them out aloud. So we have an anonymous participant who is thanking for the presentation and is asking, the asking person was wondering if Singo can speak a bit more about the perpetrators of GBV in the case of Kenya. So who are the perpetrators of GBV in Kenya, and where has the knowledge of security forces being also that the perpetrators are these also the perpetrators within the context of their own households? These are the questions. Could you elaborate a bit on that?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you for the question. Indeed, our study found that the perpetrators of GBV are, in the most cases, usually within family relationships, where the perpetrator is well known to the victim, and especially in cases of rape and defilement. We also found that we have cases in which, as I said, cultural practices, play into this in such a way that where, for instance, women are discriminated against on the basis of gender because they are women, they cannot own property, they cannot inherit property, where a husband has died, and then the relatives will move in and take over the property, and the widow is thrown out, and yes, the study also did indicate that there are cases in which security forces or law enforcement either are involved by way of being perpetrators or doing nothing when reports are taken to them that one has been a victim. Yeah, we have had cases where, in fact, police officers have been implicated and found guilty for having taken advantage of victims of gender-based violence who went to report to them, and instead of them giving them sanctuary, they instead violate them. So yes, so you have security forces as perpetrators or as bystanders who don't really take action, and you have close family members who perpetrate, but you also have this patriarchy, cultural-based systems that enable, gender-based violence to take place. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next question goes to anyone who spoke on the terrorism and organized crime subject. The person agrees that it has been a relative neglected part of the treaty, and is asking, why is that the case? Is it because states don't think there's much to discuss here, or is it that these provisions are seen as less important than other aspects of the risk assessment? So is it a neglection, or is it a question of priority? Who would like to jump in on this question?
I can say a little, but I will then maybe turn it over to Roy and Grisel as well, because I'm sure they have more to say on this than I do, actually. I would say, I think the IHL and human rights law provisions, which come right above the terrorism and organized crime provisions, are big, massive provisions, right? That deal with big, big, big fields of law that are hugely important, and also have a lot more to do with what the state itself is doing, right? If you're selling a weapon to a state that's using it in conflict, then you care about its compliance with IHL. If you're selling a state to a weapon for the use of its own government, you care about that state's compliance with human rights law as well. There's other things you'd care about in human rights law. I think with terrorism and organized crime, it's just a little different, right? I think states generally operate under the presumption that they're not the ones carrying out offenses under terrorism or crime law, which isn't, I'm not saying that's always true. Obviously, corruption always involves a state actor, and plenty of other offenses under terrorism and crime law can involve state actors as well. But I think those feel more like the obvious things that won't happen. It's not because they actually won't, but I think they're less exciting, maybe, and more ignored. I think there's a little bit of neglect there, if you ask me. I've been hoping we could talk about this for a while, so I was very happy to work on this paper. But anyway, Grisel and Roy may totally disagree with me on this, so I'll hand it over to them. They have more to say.
Roy, Do you want to?
Yeah, I suppose I would basically, I think I'd agree with Gillian, but maybe I can just kind of add on top of what she says as when we started looking at whether we wanted to do this and started to dig a little deeper, that was where things got a bit more interesting. When you've got Gillian saying, well, you've got 19 different terrorist related conventions, and I thought, oh, sorry, how many? 19? So we got to start going through that and see what that actually means in practice. So I think it does benefit from being, actually, let's drill down and see what this actually does mean in practice. And I pulled out as the example of corruption, where I think most licensing officials would not identify that there was this corruption link through there. So that's just one example that really struck me, that points to why you do need to go into this. So I think Gillian's right for why it hasn't been the case, but I think the paper points actually points to why it should be the case. I think that's all I'd say. I don't know if Grisel's got anything to add.
Grisel, do you want to add something to that?
Yes, of course. No, I actually agree very much with what has been said with Gillian and Roy. And I wanted also to point it out that, I mean, the issue of terrorism and transnational organized crime, it has been always at the heart of the ATT, even from its inception. Because I would like to recall, for example, in the road to the draft framework convention, when this was discussed within the framework of the open-ended working group, if you look at the report, the paragraph 23, it made the reference on these issues. It recognizes the need to address the problems related to unregulated trade in conventional weapons and their diversion to illicit market in this context, because the consideration that there's a risk that can fuel instability, international terrorism, and transnational organized crime. And if we see that from the first ATT resolution, it had been included. But the question is that the discussions within the ATT in general have been moving quite slow. We have been in our own package exercise. If we look, for example, during the Japanese presidency, the focus was diversion. So there was a particular stress on Article 11. Then in 2019, with the presidency of Latvia, the focus was gender. And of course, the provisions that are gender related were the focus. So it seems that we are unpackaging different provisions of the ATT. And that's why in my intervention, I encourage to also consider this issue in the future ATT deliberations. I think that it will depend on many issues. From the one side, if there might be in the future a president that would like to bring this topic as the thematic focus for his or her presidency, or if there's a group of countries interested also to perhaps submit working papers and try to mainstream this issue in different working groups. It seems that it will be very evident to do so in the working group on effective treaty implementation. But I think that the process is moving forward to that direction. And of course, it is not that it is not important, but perhaps it was more evident to tackle first those topics that everyone is more aware, that there's no denial of the linkages between ATT and international human rights law and international humanitarian law and gender-based violence. But precisely this type of event can help us also to raise awareness that there are other issues that need to be addressed, and that are, of course, very important and has an impact in every region of the world. So I will leave it to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grisel. There's a next question on the level of detail on reports concerning gender-based violence. So in these reports, often the perpetrators are described as a member of an armed group or an armed individual, and there's not a lot of more context to these descriptions. Would it be necessary, or is it necessary to improve this? Should there be more detail on what kind of weapons is used to perpetrate GBV, or who exactly is doing it? I would post that to the GBV panel. Maybe Verity, do you want to take that one?
Anna's going to jump in first on this one, and I think Emma also. Thank you, Andre.
Hi, I think this is a really crucial question that many people have around how you sort of show causation or links between the use of arms and gender-based violence. I think the most important thing to remember, though, is that the risk assessment under the Arms Trade Treaty is forward-looking. So it's looking about what might happen in the future. You're thinking about, is there an overriding risk of this thing that you're afraid of taking place, right? So you don't need to have conclusive evidence, you don't need to show liability, that it's not this backwards looking exercise to understand exactly how past exports have been used. If you do have that evidence, it's really helpful in helping you make predictions about the future, but you don't need it to be able to consider GBV risks. So you don't need this very specific and direct causation to be able to make that conclusion reasonably. If the test was that you had to show in the past that these exact type of weapons had been used for GBV, then it would become unmanageable and an impossible exercise, and you'd never have any exports that were being denied on that basis. So it would just negate the purpose of the treaty, really. So as I say, it's really helpful when you have that evidence, but you can also draw conclusions and inferences from other pieces of information and look at all the sort of indicators and different reports that are highlighted in the various resources that we've spoken about to make this assessment of future risk, of what might happen should this export, what's likely to happen if this export goes to the destination and to the end user that's being proposed. I'll hand over to Emma, though, because I think she might have a few words to say on some of the practicalities around this.
Yeah, thanks very much, Anna. I think you summed it up very neatly. You know, if we were always relying on concrete evidence of GBV and arms correlations, unfortunately, the evidence base is not, you know, due to underreporting, we would have some significant difficulties. Looking at previous reporting is incredibly useful, but in terms of being able to identify specific actors, obviously those details tend not to be entailed in UN reporting. But that's where we've been drawing on local knowledge, and embassy networks is incredibly important, and in particular CSOs on the ground who have that connection and understand the regional dynamics, both in a past context, but also in a forward-looking context in terms of what the risks might be in the future, which is incredibly important to understand. I think also being aware of the fact that, you know, diversion risk is something we need to consider in this as well. The risk of diversion of weapons to alternative uses, even if it's legitimate end use, in a context where you have very high prevalence of GBV, where you know there is poor export controls, that is something that should be borne in mind alongside all the other risks that you have. So in terms of drawing direct lines between specific violations is unfortunately not something that we have the capacity to do. So this is one of the reasons why having these kind of qualitative assessments and holistic approaches to these kind of queries is incredibly useful as licensing officers. This is something that we're kind of mainstreaming. We're making sure that all of our geographic officers, when they're giving us destination inputs, that they're bearing in mind, they're looking at the whole context. And we've also been sharing with our embassy network as well.
Perfect. Thank you very much. The next question from Francesca Batto, thank you very much for the question, concerns the changing dynamics of GBV in the context of COVID-19. So we have had, there's some changes in dynamics of GBV, and the question is, are there any other changes in trends pertaining to GBV and arms foreseen in the future? I would address that question to the same panel that spoke right now.
Yeah.
Maybe Emma, you want to take it? Or Verity?
I would like to say something about it as well.
After you, Stephen.
Stephen, you have the floor. We don't hear you, Stephen, so let's first hear Verity and then go back to you, Stephen. Verity, please.
Sure. Unfortunately, I think all countries in the world have seen a rise in GBV. Now, the question from Francesca is asking around changes in trends to do with GBV and arms. The biggest report that I can reference in this area is one that Amnesty produced last December, and it was looking at police and state overreach in the context of COVID. And it documented abuses in over 60 countries during 2020. Now, many of those were using less lethal weapons, not weapons contained within the scope of the ATT. But I think if we extrapolate from that increased levels of violence were occurring and gender-based violence was on the rise, then I think, unfortunately, we will see an increase also due to COVID-19 and the stresses and strains that is placing on communities, governments and security actors because of the pandemic.
Thank you very much, Verity. Stephen, are you with us?
Yes, I am, Chair. Thank you. I wanted to intervene on that question in relation to COVID-19. This is, of course, not based on any research, but it's based on the reports that we have continued to hear since COVID-19 started. There has certainly been a sharp increase in SGBV cases during the COVID period in our part of the country. And I think some people have speculated that it could have to do with number one, the massive loss of jobs. Some sectors have virtually closed down, like the hospitality industry. And so people have suddenly found themselves at home, quarantined or curfewed at home without any income. And so frustrations tend to go to run high. And that could be one of the reasons why these cases are increasing. Certainly, one needs to undertake a systematic study to explain why, but my direct response would be yes, we see increased cases that are reported. Remember, GBV cases are usually, many are not reported, but in our context during the COVID-19, reports have really increased, and hardly 2 days pass before you have had a major case of violence being reported, GBV violence being reported. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Looking at the time, I think we will take the last question. And this concerns the mechanism in the ATT. What mechanism in the ATT would states parties tap into when the state of destination would be using small arms and light weapons for terrorism activities?
So I can jump in quickly on this, and I'll try to be brief. I know we're basically out of time. That's the risk assessment. So exporting states have every means available to them of just simply refusing that export. And that's what the risk assessment's for. It's not like the risk assessment says if the weapons could be used to commit or facilitate these acts if they're committed by non-state actors. It says commit or facilitate these offenses no matter what. So as is so often the case with the treaty, Article 7 is really quite a powerful provision if you let it be. I'll also just point out that Article 6 deals with a few other prohibitions, including prohibitions that could certainly be relevant if a state actor were committing these types of crimes or committing acts of terrorism. And you would hope, cross your fingers, hope that if a state were doing that, they might also be subject to, say, sanctions by the United Nations, which would also result in a prohibition under Article 6. So there's multiple means of keeping arms from flowing to states that are themselves acting in that way. And that would clearly militate against a transfer in the risk assessment process.
Thank you very much, Gillian. Being mindful of the time, I want to take this opportunity to thank all the participants very much, the representatives of the governments of Ireland and Panama, the Stimson Center, Safer World, the Security Research Information Center, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and the Harvard Law School's International Human Rights Clinic. And also a big thank you to our host, Control Arms. In my opinion, it is really important to have such a vivid discussion next to the formal ATT process, and I'm very happy to have had such an active participation in this session. So thank you all. Have a nice afternoon and see you soon. All the best.
Sorry, Andre, can I just say one last little thing before we go?
Of course, you may, Roy.
In the chat, there are the links to the reports, our report and the Stimson report. So Paula at Control Arms, if I can just ask you just to leave the meeting open for a couple of minutes, so people, if they want to, can download those, can hit those links and download those reports. And that's it. Thanks, everyone.
Perfect. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you and bye.